Hey, what's up, guys? Hey, just wanted to have a very quick talk with you about sort of the world of baseball statistics and kind of where I stand on things. I know that I talk from time to time about WAR and that I like to sort of poke at it and find little holes to dig and things like that. It's somewhat interesting to me, although it's not quite as fascinating to me as it may be to other people. That's one of the aspects of WAR that kind of gets me a little bit on edge. And if you follow me like on Twitter, if you watch any of the silly arguments that I get into with people, there are reasons for it, and there are parts of WAR that I personally think are a little bit too algorithmic and don't take into consideration like what is actually happening in the context that the statistics were created in. But I think a little bit of context is probably in order here. I've been interested in baseball statistics for my entire life. It's a little bit comical if I talk to somebody who immediately assumes that I am stuck in the 1980s when it comes to baseball statistics, or the 1960s or the 1950s, considering what my age is. I also find it funny when people claim that I am somehow statistically blind or illiterate, which isn't the case, right? I mean, I don't want to make a video telling you about credentials and stuff like that, but I do know a thing or two about statistics and data analysis. The problems that I have come when we rush to conclusions based on very little data, or when our data is so packed with assumptions, especially assumptions about things that we can do with fielding to try to compare like left fielders with second basemen and that sort of thing, that it starts to lose all sense of realism and sense of worth, at least in my mind. So that's the reason why I end up coming up with a lot of this stuff. I do want to let you know, though, that I'm not exactly a stranger to a lot of the debates and discussions that we have. It's really funny because if you go on to the biggest offenders of this are social media sites, Facebook and Twitter in particular. Reddit, not quite to the same extent, but that's because a lot of the people on Reddit are actually younger than I am, and many of them were not really around in the times of the message boards when these arguments first came up. When you go to Twitter and to Facebook and look at what the baseball fans say, you'll see a bunch of discussions that have been repeated time and time again over at least the last 20 years, if not longer. I would estimate that some of these discussions probably began on Usenet. I could get into Usenet and the good and bad side of Usenet. If you know your history, you know that Baseball Prospectus, for example, started largely on Usenet. The problem with Usenet is that Usenet was never created to have any sort of longevity. And so a lot of the discussions that underpin statistics like WAR happened in an environment for which we have no record and that we can't get back. The problem that existed with Usenet in the olden days was always trying to maintain prior postings so that people didn't just repeat the same questions over and over and over again. I don't know that the Internet FAQ necessarily began because of Usenet, but I do know that in the old days of Usenet, most of those Usenet pages would see the FAQ reposted like once a week. And the problem is the problem of data retention, right? There was no real way to retain a lot of the data needed because there were so many posts that you didn't have any way of holding onto the hard disk space. Usenet itself is an interesting thing. If you know about Usenet and its many uses today, retention today on Usenet tends to go back to 2007. And you'll wonder, well, what happened to everything from like when did it start? 1979, 1980 through 2007? Well, some of the oldest posts are around, but the posts that we're probably interested in, the Eternal September era, 93, and then a little bit afterwards, which is when all of these discussions started, those, unfortunately, for the most part, have been kind of lost to time. Yeah, I know. You can look at the Google Groups, archive and stuff, and then you'll discover soon that there's no way to search, and that the whole system that puts it together is not very functional. Welcome to the reality of Usenet. I digress a little bit, but I do know that a lot of the discussions that we have today about certain fundamentals have been had in the past. The frustrating thing about these discussions today, though, is that the people who engage in them tend to be one of two types, right? You have people who are skeptics, who don't believe fully in the narrative that is being told to them online, and by baseball, gurus, and by sort of self-appointed statistical mavens of the sport. These are the people I do tend to side with. And then you have the people who are the defenders, as my friend Not Gaetti would call it. They're the warmongers, and that's really what they are. I would consider them to be hawks. Right? These are people who are going to come around, and if they smell what they think is fresh blood, they will attack. This is one of the reasons why Twitter can be a very exhausting experience, because if you post one thing and the wrong type of person sees it, or it's you posted somebody who is, for example, not employed and has a lot of time on his hands, you might wind up with like 10 replies, in a couple minutes. You might wind up with dozens of people, attacking you or saying things about you or whatever. That's sort of the reality of the way that communication works in these days. But the funny thing about those who defend these statistics is that when you start bugging them about stuff and start asking them about things, you'll discover that they don't understand how it works, right? The batting side of WAR is not that hard to figure out. A lot of the math is up there, thanks in large part to Tom Tango, who's done a lot of very good work on the subject. But if you're looking at things like the fielding side of WAR, that's where it gets a little bit murkier. And pitching, I would argue, is also somewhat murky, but my argument is that a lot of what we see as pitching is actually defense, and that we tend naturally to take credit away from the catcher when it comes to pitching duties, which I especially think is a problem for older seasons. Might not be such a problem today when you have those stupid pitch communication systems where the coach could just call the pitches and let everybody know. But when we're talking about baseball back before the technology invaded it, I would say that the catcher's role is almost certainly not well represented, not just by the statistics, but by also the nature of the sport itself. Anyway, the long story short is that I can assure you that I do know what I'm talking about when we're talking about the statistical subjects. I've been part of the community for over 20 years now. I know what's going on. I was around for a lot of things that many of the people that I'm talking to were not around for. Now, I mean, trolling and, aggressive attacks and stuff has actually always been a part of the baseball statistics community. Well, not always. If you go back to the its beginnings online, you'll see this. If you go back before then and back to the days of Pete Palmer, Bill James, and the like, there's not so much of a sort of aggressive and almost like angry tone to it, right? That's the thing that the internet does to you. There was a bit, though, of disagreement as to the right way to do things, right? I've always considered the Bill James camp to be a little bit more in the we do things openly, we show you how we did what we did type of thinking. Whereas people who ran companies such as Stats Incorporated and some of the other companies that started to compete with the Elias Sports Bureau in the 80s were much more proprietary focused and proprietary based. So as I've said before, I was at one point in time a heavy user of Baseball Think Factory, which originally was Baseball Primer. I stopped using Baseball Think Factory when the interesting people went away and it was nothing but people trolling each other, which is what Twitter is like. When what I can tell you, though, from the early days back when people would gather there is that there was a lot of disdain and upset feelings towards Baseball Prospectus. And the reason why is because Baseball Prospectus relied so heavily on models that were proprietary. That's not to say that other models were not proprietary as well. I know that Dan Szymborski's ZIPS, data, for example, is very proprietary and relies on a formula that is tweaked all the time. But there's something a little bit more open, a little bit more honest about it, at least it feels more honest than the Picada system that all the people reporting on advanced statistics in the 2000s wrote about so fondly. Biggest problem with the Picada system is that you couldn't get the stats unless you went and bought their $30 book, right? And the $30 book was filled with all sorts of, we know the right way of doing this and you don't type of language that is reflected as well in that book that Baseball Prospectus published. It's probably been over a decade now since they put that one out. That's the thing. The thing that gets to me the most is not necessarily the use of modern statistics or using creative ways to look at a problem. No, it's the smugness by which it comes about, right? Posts that are, collections of nothing but a bunch of acronyms as if it were some sort of government dossier combined with statistics that are given out in absolutely no context at all. Then if you disagree with anything, you wind up being put on the list somewhere so that people will come and attack you for whatever heretical position it is that you have. Not exactly the basis of good and honest and strong discussion. Anyway, there you go. That's sort of where I come from on these subjects. I do think that traditional counting statistics are very, very underrated these days. I very much think so. And the nice thing about the traditional statistics is that you know what they are and you can identify with them, right? It's hard to see a WAR in action, but you definitely can see like a single. You can see a home run. You can see a walk, right? These are things that you can see happening, and you can see the impact that this has on the game, right? There is always a place for this stuff, and the more the game moves towards the abstract representation of itself, the more the game is going to lose people who, frankly, don't care about all that stuff. And there are a lot of people like that out there. There you have it. I'll talk with you tomorrow. Bye-bye.